If you listened to my podcast a couple of weeks ago, my conversation with Craig, he talks about shows being packed and people being excited and wanting to build sets and almost full circle, right? These things that weren't in style or coming back in style. You've been in this hobby for so long. Is that a normal cycle?
Vintage is less crazy. When things are crazy, like modern stuff, it can go way up, but then it can go way down. When Craig was talking about how 2024 wasn't really better than 2023, that's the way it always was. They were all good years, but you weren't micro measuring to see if it was up 10% or down 10%. You had a great time. You went to some of the same shows. You had old friends, new friends. And that's the vibe I got when you and Craig were talking. You weren't micro managing that your sales were up 3.2%. It's a great hobby. You went to some great shows.
Thinking through your time in the hobby, what's different now?
It's a lot more dynamic now. But going back to what you and Craig talked about, 23 and 24 were similar. But if you go back to 22, 21, 20, there was a lot of volatility there. Roller coasters. That was not the norm. This is the norm, and I think that bodes well for vintage. If you're looking forward to being on roller coasters and occasionally having crashes and all that, vintage might not be for those kind of people. But if you're of a certain age and you really appreciate the history of baseball and the great icons that are now retired in many cases, wow, vintage is enduring. And just the fact that it's staying the same, that's okay for most vintage guys. You don't need to have a 50% increase across the board. So what you're seeing is the nuance of what you and Jeremy Lee and several others are saying. I want collectible cards that have eye appeal. Yes, I understand there's grading, there's authenticity, and there's a numerical grade. But I have my own standard and my own desire to pay a certain price for a card that I like. I have cards on ComC, and I sell the mid-grade cards before I sell the higher grade cards of some vintage stuff. I don't have a lot of vintage stuff there, but that's the collector grade. We should have great hope that the investment grade is a separate thing. There's nothing wrong with that, but the collector grade is the bread and butter. If we don't have that, then we're in trouble. But we do have that. That's why Strongsville and the National and the Philly show and Chantilly, even the Dallas card show, there's a reasonable vintage presence there that is well represented. And that's great. It's not for everybody, but it's like reverse psychology. See, you don't have to tell people to start collecting vintage. Tell them it's not for everybody. They say, hey, the people are really getting a lot out of this vintage stuff, and they seem to really be smiling. The original hobby was vintage. Topps was putting out cards for kids, but the adults in the 60s and 70s, the Jefferson Burdicks, they might keep up with the new cards, but you could just buy them. Okay, the hunt, the quest has always been about vintage.
As that timeline has shifted, it's still the hunt. The cards you're hunting might change, right? Although there are plenty of people now diving in, myself included, headlong into pre-war. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, I've opened a Pandora's box that I don't know that I can shut again. But I just love the hunt.
There's levels of scarcity, there's levels of rarity, there's levels of quest and hunt based on your budget, based on your interests. Just philosophically, do you want to have a large collection or a small collection? Do you want to have a valuable collection or a meaningful collection? And it could be all the above. There were collectors out there in the 70s and the 60s that didn't want a quest of things that were too easy. That really affected me. I like to go after things that have lower supply. And you did that with your Gehrig DeLong quest. You're not going to see them at every show. And when you do, it might be too high of a grade or too low of a grade. So that's a reasonable quest. You got a great card at a price that you were comfortable with, that you can flex about that.
I essentially paid zero for it since it was part of
That's what I did. I rarely bought card. I bought collections. And you didn't even know what you had in it. You sold off the stuff that you didn't want to get your money back. And that is still available to true collectors. If you're just a collector and you buy cards one at a time, you're going to pay retail. You might get a bargain occasionally, but if you buy a collection and you have some wherewithal and some relationships, that's what I did. Everybody did that. Then you sold your duplicates and you kept the ones you wanted. But there was always a hierarchy of demand and a hierarchy of supply. Something could be very much in demand but have high supply, and it could be very low supply but have low demand as well. But the advanced collectors, after they got all the Bowmans and the tops, they were going after the regionals and the hot dog cards and things like that. There's a quest just to get a type card, Mike. Then there's a quest to get your favorite player. Then there's a quest to get a complete set. Then there's a quest to get a complete set at a certain grade. So there's something for everybody.
Yeah, the permutations of the way this hobby can manifest itself in somebody's collection is literally endless. That's what makes it so awesome. My current quest, Jim, is a 54 Ted Williams Wiener card. I don't know where I'll find one, but I know you have one.
I'll put it on my wall just so you can drop it on the ground.
I'll try not to. Next time I visit, I will.
It's not you break it, you take it.
I found that the scarce stuff has disappeared largely. I used to see a lot of U.S. caramels, and now I don't see them hardly at all.
If it's a collector, they only have one. It's the one they're going to keep. If it's a dealer looking at it less passionately, this is just a card I'm going to sell, they're going to put a good price on it. But the Wilson Franks, Wilson Wieners that came out in hot dog packages, just forget about the condition. The supply of those is probably 1% of the 54 tops. You can't even account for that in terms of the price. It can't be 100 times more valuable. There aren't 100 times as many people wanting it. So the demand's not the same. Actually, demand would be incredible if the price was the same. But if the Wilson Franks card is 10x, because it's 100 times more rare, if it was 10x a higher price, for the equivalent condition, you got 1,000 to 10,000, I think that gives some people pause. But by scarcity, it could still be a good deal.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about shows because from my own personal experience when I was a kid, card shows are essentially the same as they were back in the 80s when I was going to my first card shows. And you got guys set up, they got a table, they got some display cases and boxes, and there's cards, and you get to thumb through them and pick some out that you might want to add to your collection. Is that been true even before that? Do you remember the first card show you ever went to?
The difference is you have full-time dealers now. Back in the early 70s, it was collectors getting together, trading, selling off their dupes. And actually, the currency, they would prefer a trade as opposed to selling. It was more of an honor system. You could get up from your table and go over across the room. It wasn't as big and say, hey, I noticed this. Can you take a look at my table? Is there anything you would be interested in? It was more of a smaller fraternity, and everybody knew everybody. It got commercialized, and that was a necessary thing. You had professional dealers. Some of them were engaging with the public, some more than others. And you had people coming out of curiosity. In the first shows in the early mid-70s, they weren't really coming out of curiosity. They were coming because, hey, this is the only show that's going to be in this town this year. They came, collectors knew. There wasn't any social media, but your collecting friends, the word got out. When Gervis and I did that first show in Dallas, it was word of mouth. And it was folding tables. It was card tables.
And you mentioned it was a small fraternity, which means the cards were more concentrated in fewer hands. Now it's been diluted significantly just because there's just more people in the hobby.
And more cards came out as the hobby got hotter and more increased awareness in the general public. One thing that stayed the same is when people sold things back in the 70s and even the 80s, and even now, they'll sell things with, in the back of their mind, they know, I can replace this. If I really want this, it is my only one, but I'm selling something. If I really wanted to get another set of 69 tops, I can get one for a similar price if I'm selling my set right here. Okay, that's become not true in some cases in the vintage world and in the ultra-modern world, that if you pass on this, or if it is sold and it leaves the premises, you may not ever see it again. That's suggested an urgency that's part of the dynamic element of the hobby that makes it exciting.
At this point in your hobby life, do you get bored? I see you at Dallas shows and you don't look bored to me.
No, I would get bored if I totally concentrated on vintage. I would get bored because I'd be looking at a lot of the same cards. And the only thing I'd be thinking about is this a good deal, or did I used to have this card? Or do I already have this card? When I started the magazines and the price guides, it was really me, myself, and I for a while. All that vintage stuff, I had to be expert on that. And I was a dealer in it as well. So now I wouldn't get bored. I like looking at it, but I have my own stuff. I've created a new lane for me that is guaranteed to keep my interest because it's a learning experience going into things I don't have as great a knowledge about.
Yeah, I find myself 40 something years into my hobby, 44 years. I'm not tired of it. I just seek a new challenge, if that makes sense.
You have to have a goal, and you do have a goal. One of the things that's endearing about your podcast is that even though you've been doing it a long time, you have goals, and you set reasonable goals. You didn't say, I'm working on these 4 sets, so I'm going to knock them all out this year. You said, no, here's the order of preference. I think I'm going to really try to complete this one.
I'm playing the long game of wanting to enjoy this hobby for the next 15, 20, however many years more God's going to keep me on this planet. So no hurry.
It's not a problem, but I did finish
in
the 70s. So that's why it was fortuitous that all of a sudden my price guide interests and abilities, because I had educational training and experience, I was really blessed to be the guy on a mission that was successful. I worked really hard, but I would have been double-minded if I hadn't gotten all the sets before I did that, because then I'd be trying to do price guides with trying to finish my sets. But I already had all the sets that were in the magazines, and not everything in the books, but I had everything that I really wanted. So that really helped me, Mike, to not be walking around thinking, having any conflict, any unintentional bias, that I really wanted to report the prices of what they were selling for. So I had to quit. And so now I'm not going back to that. I still love vintage cards.
It's a fantastic perspective. I hadn't thought about the need to be singular focused on pricing the cards and not acquiring new cards.
The only new cards I got, I'd pick up a type card because I wanted to be able to show in the almanac or in one of the price guides that this is what it looks like. And now I wish I'd have picked out something gem mint of the very biggest superstar, but I didn't. I just took what was there, and that was fine. When I started, the hobby was not as superstar oriented. You might get a little bit more for Mantle and Aaron and Mays and Clemente, but you wouldn't get 100x within the same set.
Now you got me wanting to ask a question about my childhood, is reading the Beckett monthly every month and looking at the different sets. And by and large, you had a type card most of the time, but there were times that you would skip sets to have a type card pictured under. There would not always be a type card necessarily, as space was at a premium. But what determined what card was pictured? Did you pick that card?
Originally, they were all my cards.
Okay.
That's the simplest way to do it. SCD, my buddy Bob Lemke, they did not buy the cards. They took high-res photos, which is fine, but I'm a collector. I thought, you know what? I'm still going to be a collector. I'm not going to be a dealer or an investor, but I'm going to buy the card, which actually turned out to be amazing because when we started BGS and the grading, we had all this library of stuff where we had the real card, not a photo of the card. And some of these counterfeits back in the 80s, you could tell by feel. So having the original card, even one type card, was enough to say you have the real $100 bill and the fake $100 bill. Get familiar with the real one.
Right. 3 or 4 cards you've never owned, you wish you did.
The other question is, if I did, would I still own it? You open up a pack, a modern pack, and you get a $10,000 card. For most people, it's not, oh, wow, that's going to go in my collection. For a lot of people, it's, hey, that's $10,000. There's a lot I can do with that.
Sure.
The best marriages are honest and not just not telling lies, but your wife knows what's going on and you can't hide that. I just got a $10,000 card, but we're not going to use that for baby formula or diapers for our little child. That's the problem when you get something that's very valuable. So if I would have had the Lajoie or I'd won the Wagner, I don't know that I'd still have it. A lot of life goes by and you think, I got this card. It's probably too valuable to keep at home. Now that there's grading, it can be slabbed and protected, but you're going to have it at the bank. I made a decision after I lost a few times. Maybe it's sour grapes. I just thought these $10,000 and up cards, I'm just not going to go there. There's not going to be any temptation. I'll buy hundreds of dollars of cards and $1,000 cards sometimes. But the $10,000 cards, I'll let other people bid those up.
I guess I'm talking now to the collector, Jim Beckett.
Even then, I bought collections and I spent big bucks on collections, but I was getting a discount because I was buying so much. I was buying complete sets of stuff like that. When I was a collector, yes, I would only sell the duplicates. But when I started the company, in order to not borrow money to start a company, that I sold a bunch of my sets. So yeah, so I sold too soon, but it allowed me to have some breathing room in starting a company and being able to reinvest and not be thinking I got to take a bunch of money out. I've got to feed this engine, this price guide company, and make sure it gets off the ground. That was more important to me than holding on to cards. I really sell my dad's cards. I kept those. But some of the stuff from the 50s, I had a 53 set, I sold it. I've given myself permission to lighten up and not be as driven. I think there's a difference between healthy drive and drivenness. And I probably was a little bit driven, but driven can be toxic. I don't want to be toxic. Therapeutic is enjoying the reasonable chase, the reasonable hunt. You're a good example of that. Okay, you're measured. When you get out of control, that's an addiction. So I'm not addicted. Was I ever? I don't think so. But usually the person is not the one that says whether they're addicted. It's your friends and family that say, hey, Mike.
And my wife would argue with that.
I'm saying that. But he's more of a barometer probably than you are of that.
Right.
I probably wouldn't still own those cards, Mike. I also have a rule that if I've ever owned it, I don't think I want to buy it back. I know that's a motivation for a lot of people younger than me that went through the junk wax era or the 80s and they had the Conseco rookie or the Mattingly rookie or something they couldn't afford at one time and now they want to get it. For me, the closest thing to sentimentality would be my dad's cards. And I did complete the sets he had. I filled in all the rest, just like you're doing. That was a priority for me.
For me, it's a sense of accomplishment.
Yes.
Truly.
It's not easy. It's not just about the money.
It's certainly not about the money. I have a lot better places.
I'm saying, even if you had $1 million to complete your sets, it's more fun to hunt. Do you enjoy that more, or are you finding it yourself? See, me, I wanted to find it myself.
Oh, it's way better to find it yourself. Yeah. I was never going to let anyone buy me a DeLong Gehrig.
I believe in like the 6 degrees of separation. Part of the success metric for our price guides is that firsthand is better than secondhand. That somebody told me that somebody told them. I really wanted to get firsthand. I wanted to see the card. I wanted to price the card based on my own eyes and not a third-hand report. That's why we were able to be pretty accurate, because we had guys at the shows and seeing the transaction take place. That's part of the excitement.